Good evening, and welcome back once again to the Bible Speaks Today from LBC Television Ministries, here in what today is a very rainy and dull and dreary day, at least it was when I came into the studio. Probably by the time you see this, the weather will have changed again, which is the way it is around here, isn't it? In these last 2 or 3 weeks, or last 5 weeks, I think, we've been looking at the various people who are mentioned in the Bible. We did a pretty exhaustive look at the land of Canaan in general, what it was made up of, and then we looked at the Kenites and Kenites rather, and the Jebusites. And tonight we're going to go to the Amorites, who appear to be by far the most populous or the largest group to influence Canaan in the pre-biblical days. And what's interesting to me when I do these studies is that when you read the history and some of the politics of these nations, nothing much has changed over 3,000 or 4,000 years. It's amazing to go back and see the intrigues and the political to and froing and the different allies that formed. Two lands joined together to drive this one out, and then they fight each other and that sort of thing. It seems like we get more civilized, yes, and we get more technical, but basically it comes down to I want what you want and I'm going to get it. So, and the reason these people are important is that all these people that the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament mentions, are important to the people at the time because they influence what happened. And they're important to us today because we get to see how things kind of formed. As I said to you before, our temple, the Temple of Solomon, was based on Canaanite design, which itself, since the Canaanites were basically a generic term for everybody, was probably based on ancient temple designs going back to 3000 BC. Our churches today are sort of aligned on the temple outline, the Holy of Holies, or the sanctuary at the front here, and then the rest of it back here. And it's amazing how much of what we take for granted today and just accept as the way things are is founded on events, peoples, customs, that sort of thing, that happened thousands of years ago. It's always a source of wonder to me. Anyway, the Amorites. Let's talk a little bit just in general terms. They were a fairly large group of people who lived, or existed from the 21st century BC to the end of the 17th century BC. That's when they were kind of popular. They established some very serious city-states, notably Babylon, of which more later, which used to be a little tiny town, became a huge big city. In the Akkadian and ancient Egyptian and Sumerian texts, the term Amuru refers to them. It got basically changed over the centuries to Amorite, but that's what it was. And that's the name, incidentally, of their principal deity, Amuru. So, the earliest Sumerian sources, that's really, really early on, 2400 BC, start referring to them about 2400, as I say, BC. And the land of the Amorites, the Amuru, was called Martu land. And that's associated with, not with Mesopotamia, but with the lands to the west of the Euphrates, to Canaan, places like that. And what was to become Syria by the 3rd century BC. So they were pretty widespread, pretty numerous. They appear, if you read some of the texts about them, they appear as pretty much of an uncivilized bunch and mostly nomadic. I suppose city dwellers in those days, as they do today sometimes, refer to people who live in the country, country folk, as sort of uncivilized. Certainly not so many 100 years ago, that was pretty much the standard thing. Or you came from the country, you were uneducated and simple, whereas we in the city had all our smarts together. And of course the Sumerian Empire at the time was a big empire of city-states. Anyway, from about the 21st century BC, first of all, around 2200 BC, and we know this because of geology and studies and climate and that sort of thing, there was this very long major drought, probably lasting 50, almost 100 years, drought in that area, which caused a large-scale migration of the Amorite tribes into what is called southern Mesopotamia. In other words, as the water dried up, as the rivers dried up and that sort of thing, people start moving to where there's water, just as it happens today. So there's this very large scale of movement, and because more and more of them came over into the land. I mean, in fact, they were. Well, just as a side note here, there was a dynasty of Ur. You remember Ur, where Abraham came from, right? Or where Abraham was before he, moved up in Canaan. The Amorites actually destroyed that third dynasty of Ur by simply overwhelming them with numbers, and also they knocked down or beat or conquered the long existing, the Babylonian city-states of that empire, Laish and Kish and places like that. They've been around for hundreds of years, and the Amorites gradually moved in and took them over. The most famous, obviously, the one we know, is Babylon, of course, which was relatively, under the previous empire, a relatively minor and insignificant state, and yet under the Amorites became a very, very important place, and continued to be that way under successive dynasties, right up through Nebuchadnezzar, until, of course, the Persians came in much later. The Amorites wrote in a what's the word, dialect, in a hand of Akkadian, which was like close to ancient Egyptian. And we found tablets at Mari. I've mentioned a place called Mari before, where archaeology has discovered tablets from several different dynasties, all written in languages that can be interpreted. And they found them dating between 1800 and 1750 BC, so they were there for quite a while, okay? What's interesting is that the language shows, what's the right word, northwestern, if I can say that, northwestern Semitic forms and words and the way things are put together, which are very similar to the languages of Canaan, of the various tribes in Canaan. So all of these tribes we're talking of, all these nations, if you like, small nations, big tribes, whatever, Amorites, Kenites, Jebusites, all had a basic language that was recognizable, almost as if there were different dialects, although that's probably not the case. But they all had basic root words, okay? And one of we don't have a lot of information about the Amorites. A lot of it comes from the names used. So if an Amorite name pops up in the tablets, you know that, okay, there's Amorites in that area, sort of thing, From the position of the nations to which the Amorites emigrated into, and this is going to sound awfully familiar, they considered them a rural, country, uneducated group. And in fact, going back to that dynasty of Ur that eventually collapsed under the Amorites, the king of Ur at the time, Shushan, Shoestinn rather. Uh, this is going to sound familiar, as I say, built a 175-mile wall from the Tigris to the Euphrates. Now, if you go look on your map of Iran, Iraq, and that area today, you will see where the Tigris comes down and the Euphrates comes down to the sea. He built a wall between the two rivers, 170 miles long, to try and keep them out. Well, obviously, and like so many walls that we have erected, including the Great Wall of China, which in its day, or for a while, was very effective until it just became so tremendously manpower intensive to man and keep occupied that eventually fell into disrepair. And so people came through it. The old Amorites, the ones we're talking about now who came off, appear as nomadic tribes ruled by obviously warrior chiefs and that sort of thing, who literally took over the lands they needed to graze their herds. They were, kept great herds of cattle, that sort of thing. And not unlike the Israelites in the desert, they needed to expand off and find other places. I mean, some of the it's kind of interesting. The bad things that people say about each other tend to stay around longer than the good things. In other words, when you dig up these tablets and you find personal notes in them, they tend to be scurrilous tales as opposed to how the other people were shining stars. For example, they call them the Martu, the Amorites, right? The Martu who know no grain. In other words, they're not farmers and planters. They're sheep herders and cattle herders. The Martu who know no house or town. They live in tents in the desert. Oh dear, how terribly primitive. Who does not bend his knees to cultivate the land. All these people that they were moving I should say, were city-states, lived in towns and houses. And here come these, quote, barbarians, who didn't obey the niceties of things, shall we say. But they did eventually, as I say, usurp the local people and take the place over. And in fact, they did a lot of it. I mean, you see in the history books leaders with Amorite names, if you go back, assuming power in Isan, in Lhasa, Babylon, as I said, and the old Assyrian Empire basically, because of the Amorites becoming this empire, if you will, they actually became the most powerful group rather. The previous Assyrian Empire, which ran from about 2050 to 1750, fell away preceding the rise of the Amorite king Hammurabi of Babylon. Now, most of you have heard of Hammurabi. There's some wonderful the Gilgamesh saga comes from that period of time. The Hammurabi Code, for those of you who might be interested, is in fact very similar to our Ten Commandments that we know, which is not a surprise really, because if you wanted to sit down, put down rules for life in 10 rules, 10 laws, the Ten Commandments is probably what you come up with, or something like it. And there's a lot of scholars who feel that the biblical writers of old, trying to put down God's words in an understandable form, used the knowledge of the Hammurabi Code to spell it out. Anyway, by about 1809 or so, the Amorites were kind of firmly in charge of BC, that is, really pretty much the ongoing people in that part of the world. And as I say, because the Amorite language is one of the Canaanite languages, they obviously they obviously merged in well with what was already there. In fact, they're usually considered to be native to the regions of Syria and the Transjordan by modern historians. I mean, the rise of the Amorite kingdom in Mesopotamia brought about a whole lot of political, social, economic subdivisions. Especially in southern Mesopotamia, the division into kingdoms, large kingdoms, as opposed to the Babylonian city-states, which were each little city ran itself and was independent of everybody else. Now all these city states became divided up into large kingdoms, which meant you could join together for commerce. You could trade with each other easier. Presumably the money sort of sorted itself out, and it's made it widened the influence. One of the things I read, and I made a note of it here, is that men, land, and cattle, the three big things in that culture, men being the men, land being, what you had was what you had, and cattle obviously being the trading, or the thing you did, raise cattle, ceased to be physically to belong to the gods. But previously then, the gods could say, hey, the priests would say, hey, the gods want this or the gods want that. And that's been done away with. Or to the temples, or even the king. It belonged to the people who had them. Okay, the new what's the word? The new Amorite kings, if you will. They gave or rented out, if you like, great parcels of royal land, so people had more, more land to work on. They also did away with, and I'm trying to find what I put down here. Oh yeah, I made a note here that they reduced the taxes and the forced labour and trying to encourage a new society. Now, even today you can see the effect of that. First of all, we stop being isolated little groups of people and we become one kingdom, and culture and trade and everything flows. Then you reduce the taxes. I mean, you've got to know that reducing the taxes makes everybody feel really happy. And so what they changed the society to basically was a society of big farmers and free citizens, free, not slaves or anything, and enterprising merchants, which was to last throughout the ages. I mean, it really was a big thing. The priests did assume the service of the gods and cared for the welfare, and the king cared for the welfare of his subjects. But the life of the country, the economic life of the country, was no longer exclusively in the hands of the king or the priests, which made things work a lot better. Okay? The Mesopotamian civilization that was there before seemed to have survived the arrival of the Amorites, as did the indigenous Babylonian people seem to have survived, but they got merged in. Okay, the religious and the ethical and the technological science and all that the Mesopotamian kingdoms were developing. Okay. Did not seem to be greatly affected by all this. So we got really the best of both worlds, if you will. The original civilization, the Mesopotamian civilization, which was making great strides in scientific discoveries and ethical, rules of law and that sort of thing, whilst it seems to have absorbed the Amorites into them, the Amorites set the people on a new path of being free citizens and good merchants and that sort of thing. And at the same time, all these other developments came, kept coming on. Some art critic I quoted or read rather, when I was researching this, mentioned that whilst there weren't many examples of Amorite art around, it was no surprise because all the original style of paintings and things like that, and carvings and sculpture and all that, seemed to carry on without a hic right through all that. So, you know, instead of it being an earth-shattering turning over of everything, this Amorite invasion, if you want to call it that, this Amorite annexation, seems to have had the best of both worlds. It improved the status of the everyday man, and at the same time kept the worship of the gods going. Didn't ban any of them, just kept them going, and it kept the economy, increased the economy tremendously, and the whole area became a really thriving economic, you know, what have you. I mean, the area of the Amorite kingdom stretches from like 2000 BC to about around 1500 or 500 years, which is quite a long time. And it was not long after, well, they had moved, had been in there a while, but about halfway through the 500-year period I'm talking about, was that the whole area became known as Babylonia, in honor of the fact that, or in recognition of the fact that Babylon had become this major city. And later empires and dynasties took Babylon even further. I mean, it was one of the 7 wonders of the world at one stage, was it not? Okay. Now, what happened was that something went wrong. I don't know what. I couldn't find out an exact, you know, reason for it. But 2 kings, Puzur-Sin from Assyria, the north, okay, and King Adasi, between about 1740, 1735, for about 5 years, they invaded the Babylonian area and gradually pushed the Amorites out. It doesn't say anything about, I couldn't find anything, what happened to the original Babylonian inhabitants, this sort of thing, but they started to push the Babylonites out. And then the Amorites stayed put, fought the way back, you know, retreating all the time, till eventually they were back to Babylon, just held the Babylon state. And then, of course, the Hittites came in 1595 and sacked it. And so the Amorites kind of disappeared from that area, but as we shall see in a minute, turned up elsewhere. And in fact, they were replaced by the Kassites, who we know very little about too. But anyway, the ones, when they were expelled, what they did was they came around the Mediterranean, gradually, not all in a big mad rush, but gradually came around and started to filter in to Canaan. So there was a large Amorite population, if you will, in Canaan, immediately after 1500 and something, okay? And what's interesting is, remember I said last week, or a week or two ago, that Canaanite seems to be a generic term for all the different tribes that lived in the land of Canaan, you know, even though they had different names themselves. One of the big examples is that the Amorites, what was left of them, became known as Canaanites. In other words, they kind of merged into the land, became part of it, and yet still maintained their traditional. Okay? And so by the time we get to our Bible times, we have Canaanites occupying the land of what is now Israel. We have that group made up of, or those peoples made up of Jebusites, Amorites, Hittites, you know, all different remnants of different groups that have moved in. And all these groups had all their own religious, cultural differences. So you've got in this small area, and Israel, the land of Israel is relatively small, you have this potpourri of different dialects, different accents, different attitudes, different gods. It's a real mixture. And then, so when we get to Bible times, and the Israelites come into the land, you can see what they're up against. To the people who live there, they're just another bunch of people who've got nowhere to go and are invading their land, another bunch of immigrants. Do we want them here? No, we don't. Okay? It becomes very interesting. So next week, when I get back with you, we're going to be talking about the biblical Amorites, because they're the ones that we obviously mentioned in the Bible. But you have to remember that they descend from this huge nation that at one stage occupied, ran and ruled the vast majority of Mesopotamia. A real force to be reckoned with. So they all had their stories of when we was great and when we was powerful. Okay, so keep your Bible handy, and I'll see you next week. Good night.